And he was a common man. He came from a poor family. His father had died. His mother struggled to make a living running an inn that the family owned. So they were kind of in the merchant class of England. And yeah, but they weren't wealthy. And he could speak their language. That was his language.
Okay. So now he comes over to America, and he's back and forth in America all the time. What is it that he's talking about that stirs... We know that he stirs people to trouble in England because he's challenging the Church of England. He's saying, you know, you've got to feel it in here. You guys are dead inside. And he's causing people to be unstable. He says they're he's whipping people up into a frenzy, and they're all emotional, and you know all the stuff that Obama says about tea parties now. Tell me about when he comes over here to America. What is his message that begins to light the fire for the American Revolution?
Well, one of the things you have to understand about colonial America is that most of the colonies also had established state churches, just like in England. Many of the colonies, the Church of England was their state church. And so he's addressing many of the same problems there. He says, your religion has just become routine and lifeless to you. And I'm not even sure, Whitefield says, that the priests get it. You know, are you priests even in your heart Christians? And of course, this is very offensive. I mean, it needs to be said, but it's also very offensive. And so if you're a pastor and he says this about you, you're banned from the church. Right. And so he ends up in trouble almost everywhere that he goes, and he's often banned from the churches. But for Whitefield, this plays right into his hands, because then he has full permission to go into the fields and have these mass meetings. And that's where he feels the most comfortable. Now, he is attacked. I mean, they've thrown rotten eggs at him, tomatoes. I read an account of somebody threatened him with a bull. You know, I mean, who was setting this stuff up? Was this just people who didn't like him, or was this kind of a setup?
Well, this kind of opposition was going on in England. It didn't happen in America. And what Whitefield felt, the Anglican established clergy were behind a lot of this. Now, this was never proven in history. But
so it's like maybe the pastors' unions
hiring some thugs to go out and break up the meeting.
I'm just saying, there was an Andy Stern in the story someplace. All right.
Well, and I think sometimes when you strike a chord with people and you start gaining that kind of celebrity, sometimes it makes people mad. Sure. You may have some experience.
No, I have no idea what you're talking about. Back in just a second. Last weekend I was in New Jersey, and I was speaking in front of a group, and there were several pastors that were in this audience. There were about about 1,000 people there, and I started talking about the guy we're talking about tonight, George Whitefield, and I started telling the story about who this guy was and what he taught the American people. When I finished, an African American pastor, evangelical, got up and he was going to say the closing prayer, and he got up and he looked at me and he said, I am never going to preach the same again. I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing now. It all makes sense to me. I think George Whitefield is a man for today again. He is complicated. He is controversial. We'll get to his views on slavery, which is bizarre, but man of his time, I guess. He was a man who was years before the Revolution was teaching colonists that they could have a relationship with God. They could stand up to authority. He's the man that laid the groundwork for the Revolution. He's the guy who taught America, stand up for yourself as an individual. Whitefield. If there was no Whitefield, no revolution. Back with Thomas Kidd, Associate Professor of History at Baylor University, author of The Great Awakening and the Roots of Evangelical Christianity in Colonial America. And could you make that title any longer? Then Jerome Mahaffey. He is the Associate Professor of Communication of Indiana University East and author of Preaching Politics, The Roots of... of religious rhetoric, George Whitefield and the founding of a new nation. Okay. Let's just go back to the question I asked you last time. Why no George Whitefield? Tell me about his idea of the individual rights versus collective rights, that it's the power of the individual.
Well, I think at the heart of the message that he was trying to teach people in England and America was that an individual needs to take responsibility for his or her own faith, and that God is offering them salvation through Christ, and that they need to individually appropriate that. And it made, I think, there was an implication within that all people are also equal before God, because they stand in the same relationship to God, their need of salvation. They're all created by God, and so they're all equal before God. You mentioned about slavery earlier. I mean, he did have complicated views about slavery, but one thing was clear.
It's not too complicated. He was for it. He brought it to Georgia.
Right. Well, yeah, and he was a slave owner, unfortunately. But he was always clear that slaves had souls that needed to be saved.
Which was an odd idea back in his time, or not?
Well, there were some slave masters who were part of the Church of England who said, we don't even need to tell these slaves about Christianity because we're not even sure that they are even able to be saved. And besides, if we tell them about Christianity, they may start getting ideas about freedom and liberty.
Yes,
and,
they would.
And
Yes,
Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt and this sort of thing. We just don't want to tell them about that.
He was strangely for slavery, but when he got to Maryland, when he first made his first trek to Georgia from New York, he's coming down through Maryland, and he first sees plantations, and he's horrified at slavery. He's for slavery, but horrified because he thinks people are treating. He's like, you've been kind to slaves. They have souls. But he didn't make that final leap. I found it so bizarre that he was for slavery, but he couldn't get his arms around the way you were treating, like there's a good way to treat your slave.
Right. Well, in that sense, he's as problematic as the Bible is about this, because the Bible has verses that say things like, masters, be kind to your slaves.
Right.
And he just took that at face value and hadn't quite gotten to the point where he would question even the institution.
But he did over in England, if I'm not mistaken, he did have influence on Newton, John Newton, right?
That's right.
John Newton. Play this clip. This from one of my favorite movies, Amazing Grace. Watch this.
Pitt has asked me to take them on, the slavers.
I'm the last person you should come to for advice. I can't even say the name of any of my ships without being back on board them in my head. All I know is 20,000 slaves live with me in this little church. There's still blood on my hands.
Will you help me, John?
I can't help you. But do it, Wilbur. Do it.
That is the man who wrote Amazing Grace, the song. When you know the story, here's a guy who believed in slavery, yet played a role in inspiring that man. Sometimes history is a little complex. Back in just a second. Thomas Kidd, Jerome Mahaffey, talking about George Whitefield, a founder that you probably never heard, and he's really not a founder. He's more of the seed for the founders. He is the guy who I said at the beginning to the 912 group, grow them, grow them. That's what he did, unbeknownst to him. Barbara has a question on George Whitefield.
Yes, as you're saying, we want to grow more people like George Whitefield. Well, when I was reading about George Whitefield, I was amazed at what he came from, that he grew up in such poverty, that he never had a father figure in his life. He was not a great student. He got into youthful scrapes. And yet, I want to know, so many of our American youth share those circumstances, or many of them. What was it that motivated him at age 18 to decide to work his way through Oxford? What can our youth learn from him?